in the context. But if you think about what we've been studying in Leviticus, how that God was making them separate. They were supposed to be holy as he was holy. And he was giving them ways of doing that. And so he was, for lack of a better term, making them special. And we just finished talking about the feasts that they had. So why did they have, what were these feasts for? Why did they have them? They were to remember. They were to help them remember. If you think about the easiest one for me to remember is the Passover feast, because they were supposed to eat it standing up and ready to travel. And when their children would ask them, they would tell them what God had done for them and tell them about it. So it was a way of propagating, teaching, and remembering what God had done. And so we see that in what we've just studied, and we start in chapter 24. Excuse me. And Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel that they bring unto thee pure olive oil beaten for the light, to cause a lamp to burn continually. Without the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting, shall Aaron keep it in order from evening to morning before Jehovah continually. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. He shall keep in order the lamps upon the pure candlestick before Jehovah continually. Now, okay, we just came from the feast and remembering and talking about the entire context, them being special, and then we jump into this lamp thing. And think with me for a minute. The temple, the tent of meeting itself, was covered over, and it had layers of cloth on it. The only light inside it was this lampstand. So it would be dark without the lampstand. Now, if you go over to Zechariah chapter 4, and we're not going to go there today, but go read it sometime. Zechariah has a vision. And in that vision, it's like the lampstand is representing the children of Israel shining to the nations around them. Does that ring any kind of bell? You see, the lampstand in there representing Israel shining to the world. So as we think about that for a minute, where does the light come from? Not the light of the lampstand, the light. God is the light. So if you think of, turn over to Luke chapter 2. Let's read that for a second. Helps when I turn my mouse on. Luke chapter 2. And the context of this passage we're going to read is Simeon in the temple. Simeon is an elderly man who has been promised by the Spirit of God that he will see the Christ before he dies. That's the context here. And in verse 20, we can read part of that. We'll start in verse 26. And it had been revealed unto him by the Holy Spirit that he should not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came into the Spirit in the temple. And when the parents, that's Mary and Joseph, when the parents brought the child Jesus, that he might do concerning him after the custom of the law, then he received him into his arms and blessed God and said, Now lettest thou thy servant depart, Lord, according to thy word, in peace. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all the peoples, a light for revelation unto the Gentiles, and a glory of thy people of Israel. I had never, until I was studying for this, I had never noticed this passage saying that Christ would be a light unto the Gentiles. And I thought, that's interesting. It slipped by me. And here we go back to Exodus, or Zechariah, and he's talking about the lampstand that's mentioned in Exodus being a type of the people of Israel shining to the people around them. And you can't think of all that without thinking about us now in the New Testament. So what do you think about when you think about the light in the New Testament? Us, okay. If you look in Matthew chapter 5, that's the Beatitudes area, the Sermon on the Mount area. He says, you are the light of the world, just like he says, you are the salt of the earth. So yes, there. What else do you think about? What? Good, okay. If you look in John chapter 8, there's an interesting passage here. You will remember it as soon as we start talking about it. But if you look in verse 12 of John chapter 8, and therefore Jesus spake unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. So Jesus said he was the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have light, the light of life. So we have the light, Christ claiming he's the light, and then Christ saying we are the light. And if you look over in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, excuse me, we see how we are the light. Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 15, do all things without murmuring and questioning, that ye may become blameless and harmless, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you are seen as lights in the world. So we are shining forth Christ's light. God is the source of the light. The world sees us as light. Why? Because we're like God. Not because we're good, but because we're like God. Because we're acting like God. Because we are without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. That ought to really ring home to us today. Because that's where we are. Kathy was talking to me earlier this week, and you look around the world and you see all these people that think that it's normal. It's normal to go in to a shop and just pick up whatever you want and walk out with it. That's considered okay now. We know it's not. We should know and act better than that. So we go back to the temple. We see this light stand in there, and it's amazing how it's represented or shadows into the New Testament. Here in Leviticus chapter 24, when he comes out and says, okay, keep this light stand going all the time. I want it to shine forever. And if you go back to Exodus 25, I believe it is, it talks about how Aaron and his descendants will do this. But the concept here is this is going to shine all the time. It's not ever going to go out. It will be the light. Yes, ma'am.
I remember, I want to know if anyone else has this memory or learned it or saw it in a movie, but when I was a kid in school, they had talked about when a loved one was at war, that you kept the light in the window, a candle burning in the window to signify that you either A, someone has passed and you remember them, or B, that someone is out to war and see that you pray for the return of them. And that's, I mean, obviously it came from the Bible, the light, I want to say a light burning. Does anyone else feel that way? Like, that just a light in the window, God's there, he's waiting for us. I mean,
I don't think you're really stretching it. The concept of light, I don't remember who it was that said it. I think Josh said light, goodness. We get that concept. And we have the thing in the back of our minds all the time about, or at least me, the lights along the shore where there's a lighthouse where ships know either to come or not to come, depending on the type of light and where you are type thing. So I think I remember lights in the window from World War II, not me personally, but hearing about it. And so, you know,
Tiny inkling of correlation.
yeah, I think shining a light is a good thing. You don't think about, maybe we should, but we don't think about when we don't shine lights, how that shines out as well. You know, we think of a light shining to show people the path, a light shining to be a beacon as a good thing. So, as far as a memory, well, this is the memory here. He's saying, remember. And even more interesting than the lampstand, which we actually know a little bit about, is the next section, which talks about the showbread, which we know almost nothing about. The showbread, we have, actually, this is the first passage that says anything about how it's made. The previous passages, it mentions it, but it's more in the context of the table of presence. Now, I've got to be careful here. Presence as in, I am present this morning, not a present as a gift. Okay? So that's what the table is called, and thereby many times we see, or I say a few times, when the showbread is mentioned, it's talked about as the bread of presence. I don't really understand why it's called that. I have some guesses, but that's all they are. It's presented weekly. The emphasis on it is given as with it are, and most people think that there were some cups and saucers there that held the frankincense that was used as part of an offering. If you remember back in the early parts, I think it's Leviticus 2, where it talks about the grain offering, where part would be offered mingled with frankincense. Many people think that they would take part of this bread, which was for the priest to eat, and they would take it and mix it with some of that frankincense and offer it on the altar. Don't know for sure. I can't find that specifically stated. But that is a thought of why they thought it was there. But here we have this bread. Let's look at verses 5 through 9 real quick here. And thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. 2/10 part of an ephah shall be in one cake. And thou shalt set them in 2 rows, 6 on a row, upon the pure table before Jehovah. And thou shalt put frankincense upon each row, that it may be to the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto Jehovah. Every Sabbath day he shall set it in order before Jehovah continually. It is on behalf of the children of Israel an everlasting covenant. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is the most holy unto him of the offerings of Jehovah, made by fire, by perpetual statute. Now, there's several things in here I want to talk about. First of all, it mentions the pure table. And if you remember, this table was made of acacia wood and overlaid with pure gold. And this table was approximately 18 inches wide and about 36 inches long. Okay. I remember growing up and hearing about as the King James says, shewbread or showbread, and bread of presence. Not sure why it's called that other than it was out. And I remember the pictures I saw. Most of them had these little cakes on it or round things where the bread was laid out in 12 nice little. An ephah. I did some conversions, attempted conversions, okay? An ephah is about 50 pounds. So 2/10 of an ephah is about 10 pounds. So each one of these cakes was approximately 10 pounds, and there were 12 of them. That's a picture to think about. So you say, okay, so these cakes were stacked, and I can imagine them seeing, stacks, 2 stacks, pyramids, maybe not. I don't know how they were stacked, but they were set out on this table. Now, another visual for you, we think of a gallon as a liquid mixture, but think of a gallon jug full of flour. That's about what it was. So that's what would go into one of those cakes. Now, of course, that could weigh different and be a different amount by how much you packed it down. But approximately, we think that these cakes weighed, the flour that went into them weighed about 10 pounds apiece. Now, another interesting thought to go with that, yeast was not in the temple. So this was pretty dense bread. It was not light and fluffy. It was a dense cake. Okay, so what did this, let's see. What did this bread represent? Because we're talking about remembering here. That's the context as I see it. Remembering, these are things that are to remember. It's out continually. What does bread mean to us? Sustenance, okay. First thing I think of when I think of bread is give us this day our daily bread. And that relates back to them because God gave them their daily bread. How did he give them their daily bread? Manna. So, and they did not always use the word bread or the word translated bread for us to mean bread as in a meal bread. It could also mean food. So you will see some translations that translate this food rather than just bread in some cases. But here we see God giving them the daily bread, and now we have, in the tabernacle we have this table of bread for the priests to eat that's changed out every week. And you think to the New Testament now. If they're remembering something, what are we remembering? How does this affect us?
I am the bread of life.
Bingo. I'm not sure what happened. There we go. John chapter 6, verses 30 through 35, and more specifically, 48 through 51. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread which cometh down out of heaven, that man may eat thereof and not die. I am the living bread which came down out of heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. Yea, and the bread which I will give is my flesh for the life of the world. Talk about tying the Old Testament law to the new law. We don't know much about the showbread, but we understand bread, and we understand what's here. This is something that really does strike home to me when we talk about the bread of life. I skipped a passage I want us to look at. Turn over to John chapter 4. This is Jesus. He's in Samaria. He's talking to the woman at the well. The woman at the well has left and gone back to tell everybody at the city. And his disciples come up to him. They had gone out for food. And in verse 31, John chapter 4, starting in verse 31, in the meanwhile, the disciples prayed with him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said unto them, I have meat that ye know not of. The disciples therefore said one to another, Hath any man brought him aught to eat? And Jesus said unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, to accomplish his work. Say not, There are yet 4 months, and then cometh the harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look in the fields, that they are white already unto harvest. And he that reapeth receiveth wages, and gathereth fruit unto eternal life. And he that soweth and he that reapeth may rejoice together. For herein is the saying true, one soweth and another reapeth. I sent you to reap that whereon you have not labored. Others have labored, and you are entered into their labor. I grew up in Alabama. In Alabama, there's a lot of cotton fields, or at least there was 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Yes, ma'am. And Kathy and I were back, 10 years ago, I guess. I don't know, when we were driving through, and we stopped the car and got out, because here was this cotton field, just white as it could be. And out behind it were some brick houses. And all I could think of was this passage. The fields are white unto harvest, not the fields of cotton, the fields that were behind it, the houses. Jesus, here it used in the ASV that I was reading from, it uses the term meat. The ESV, I think uses the term food. Once again, it's not necessarily talking about meat as in cattle. It's food, so bread fits. And I think of this, and then I think of Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. I'm the food that you need. I am what gives eternal life. Today's Mother's Day. Imagine that. How many people are going to go out to eat today, you know? Our lives, our daily lives, forget Mother's Day. Every day of our life, one of the things that we keep going on, food. It encompasses our life. Jesus says, the food I need, the food you need is me. Now, I'm not saying we should stop eating and only read the Bible, but I think that we need to kind of put it into perspective. We think of life being tied up in food and getting things done and day after day after day, and we need to think about it as in the spiritual mode here. Here in Leviticus, we have the bread of presence, the bread that represented eventually Christ. But to them, here's God that sustained them daily. He gave them what they were going to eat. So it's an interesting, an interesting thought process there. And also is, okay, if this is remembering, why is it here? Why is it in this passage? And even more so, what comes after it. One of the things that we've seen in Leviticus has to do with the fact that we have these laws where God says, tell the people this, tell the people this, tell the people this. And he says, this is the way it is, I'm Jehovah. And then right in the middle of it, we have a narrative. And this is what happens here again. In verse 10, it says, and the son of an Israelitish woman whose father was Egyptian. Now, let's just stop there for a minute. We think, this is back in Leviticus 24. We think that this was very early in the 40 years in the wilderness. And we think that because most of this book is placed there. Not positive. But it does fit in here pretty well. And with the way that the book has gone from the giving of the law into a narration a couple of times, it all seems to be at the very beginning. So how did you have an Israelish woman with an Egyptian husband?
Some Egyptians came out of Egypt with the Israelites.
Some of the Egyptians actually came out of Egypt with the Israelites. Think of it this way. And more than likely, because of the slavery or bondage issue, it's most likely that Egyptian men would have a Israeli female wife than it would be for a Hebrew man to have an Egyptian wife. Possible, but we have an example here of an Egyptian man having an Israeli or Hebrew wife. Now, with that, we think, okay, here is the son who is evidently already teenagerish, and this is early in the 40 years. Now, we are not told whether the Egyptian man is with them or not, although it is assumed he is, otherwise we don't think the son would be there. But it's interesting to think, okay, these people, can you imagine, okay, I'm married to a Hebrew, and my people are being destroyed by their God. Can you imagine how that would affect him? And she says, hey, we're going to paint blood over our doorposts because we're going to have a Passover. Otherwise, your firstborn's going to die. Can you see that? Or possibly they didn't, and the firstborn died. We don't know. But you see how that might impact the man to go with the Hebrews? To leave? Now, yes, sir.
Well, the 10 plagues is what converted Rahab, and she just heard about it. And so, like, if you live through it, I think that's part of the reason that he went through the 10 plagues, God did, is to convert as many people as he could.
Can't argue with it at all. It makes perfect sense. And so, yeah, we see this happening. Now, I do not know how true this is, but I read a couple of commentators that said that in Egypt, it was common for them to petition their gods. That I can understand. But you know, if I were to ask this, okay, I've got this stone or wood idol that I've created, and I say, I really need to do this, or I really need to get this, or I need this, or I want this. What happens when you don't get it? Well, that was what the commentator said. It was very common for them to take those idols and throw them across the room, curse them, to break them. I don't know how true it is because this is the first time I'd read that. But it makes sense. And so here we see this young man who we don't know what the fight was about, but he actually does get in a fight with a Hebrew, and he curses God. Now let's read it and see what we get here. Verse 10. And the son of an Israeli woman, whose father was Egyptian, went out from among the children of Israel. And the son of the Israeli-ish woman and the man of Israel strove together in the camp. And the son of the Israeli-ish woman blasphemed the name and cursed. And we'll get back to that comment of the name here in a minute. And cursed. And they brought him to Moses. And the mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. And they put him in a ward that he might be declared unto them, that it might be declared unto them at the mouth of Jehovah. In other words, what should we do about this? Okay, a couple of things here. One, the comment, the name. Now, this is the passage. This passage right here is the passage that the Hebrews used to say, we don't want to say the name Jehovah or Yahweh, we'll just say Lord. And they would sometimes, as they were reading, say name instead of Lord. Well, here, the word that says blasphemed the name, that word talks about reputation. When we talk about a name, I say, this is Josh. That's who he is, not what he is. Hebrew names, not all the time, but often described a person. Let's take an example. Abram. We know his name was Abram to start with. Anybody know what that means in Hebrew? What? That's what Abraham means, father of nations. What about Abram? Exalted father. God changed his name. It meant something. It was a reputation. That was who he was. Sarai. I guess that's how you pronounce it anyway, how I've always pronounced it. Sarai. Anybody know what that means? Actually, it means princess. You can imagine naming your daughter princess, right? Well, it also means contentious. And that makes sense when you look at it and you say, okay, I remember the stories of Sarah and Hagar, how when Hagar became pregnant, when Sarah couldn't, she got contentious. And so you see this concept of a contentious princess. And what does Sarah mean? My princess. So names included a reputation, not all the times, but sometimes. So here, when it says he blasphemed and cursed the name, he's talking about blaspheming and cursing the name of God. Now, here is the God that you saw do all the things in Egypt that brought them out, and you say, that ain't nothing. That's a big deal. That's like us crucifying Christ afresh. Josh is laughing at me over here. But, that's what it's saying. It's we talk about cursing the name of God, and what he's talking about is blaspheming, is repudiating, saying, no, that's not God. This idol is God. No, that's not God. I'm better than God. I can curse him. God says that's worthy of death. Let's continue reading so we can see that. Verse 13. And Jehovah spake to Moses, saying, bring forth him that cursed without the camp, and let all that heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. And thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel, saying, whosoever curseth his God shall bear his sin, and he that blasphemeth the name of Jehovah shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. And then it continues, as well the sojourner as the homeborn. In other words, it applies to people in the land that were born there, people that are Hebrews, and those that are just passing through or staying shortly. When he blasphemes the name of Jehovah, he shall be put to death. Okay. Couple of things. Notice, I want to mention about the young man. He didn't have to be circumcised to live in the nation with them. But he did have to respect God. A person that came into Israel while they were in the land and lived there didn't have to be circumcised. But they lived under the laws of that nation that was there. Just like if you come into the U.S., you're supposed to live by the laws in the U.S. We don't always hold that up perfectly, but that's what he's telling them to do. So that's the first thing. I want you to notice that the difference between this scene when he says, all that heard him, go and lay your heads on his head. What does that see? What do you see when you picture that? Do you see an angry mob? Do you see a solemn occasion? What do you see? To me, it's like, ooh, this is serious. Okay? Reminds me of laying the head on the sacrifices, hand on the head of the sacrifices. But they're saying, okay, we heard you, we saw it, whatever. Now go over to Acts chapter 7, I think it is. You don't have to turn there, but it's where Stephen was stoned. What was the attitude of that? They were stoning him for blasphemy. Same thing. What was their attitude? They were enraged. They were acting not to obey the law. They were acting out of rage. That's a warning for us today, I think. Big time. So here we see this, and one of the interesting things to me about this is that the next section, still a part of this section, if you want to call it that, talks about other penalties. And in essence, it says, hey, somebody takes a life is forfeit. So let's read that real quick, and then we'll talk about it for a second. Starting in verse 17. And he that smiteth any man mortally shall surely be put to death. And he that smiteth a beast normally shall make it good, life for life. And if a man causes a blemish in his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Breach for a breach, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. As he hath caused him a blemish in a man, so shall it be rendered unto him. And he that killeth the beast shall make it good, and he that killeth the man shall be put to death. Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the sojourner as for the homeboard. For I am Jehovah your God. Oh, wow, that phrase again. Does that phrase mean a little bit more now that we've talked about blaspheming the name and it being the representation? What does Jehovah mean? Yahweh. What does his name mean?
Isn't it related to the verb I am?
It means the existing one. Yes, that's where the I am that I am came from. I am the existing one. I am the one that exists by myself. I don't need anything else. I am there. I always have been. That's what that means. So when you blaspheme his name, you're saying, nope, that's not you. So every time we've heard him say, do this, I am Jehovah, that's kind of what he's saying. I'm the one that started it all. And Moses spake unto the children of Israel, and they brought forth him that cursed out of the camp and stoned him with stones. And the children of Israel did as Jehovah commanded. Now, a lot of people think of this, and they think, ooh, that's harsh punishment. I want you to think of it slightly different. How many times have you seen in the news or heard something that was terrible? I'm not denying that. And people get very vengeful about it. This is setting limits. This is saying you don't do more than what was there. In other words, your judgment is just. We've gone over that before. So think of this more as limits. And even Jesus, what did he say about an eye for an eye? What did he say? Bless him that cursed you. So it's not so. I think of this not so much as this is what must be done, although that was the law, but this set limits as well so that the people couldn't overgo. And if you think about the laws of murder, someone, if you look, you don't see it here, but in Numbers 35, verses 1 through 28 and 29 through 40, it talks about the cities of refuge. And it gives example. If somebody lays in wait and kills somebody, they're a murderer. They shall die. But if the axe flies off the handle, if the axe head flies off the handle and kills somebody, they're not a murderer, but they're still under the penalty of a life for a life. And so they would flee to the cities of refuge and would grab hold of the altar and plead their case before the priest. And if the priest said, yes, this was manslaughter, they stayed within that because under the Old Testament law, the next of kin was required to make that right. If they stayed in the city of refuge, they were not the avenger of death, the next of kin, could not come and kill them. However, if they left, they were still subject to that judgment until the year of Jubilee or the high priest died. And we'll cover part of that next week. So that's kind of the concept here about this death. scared myself. So we see this where God said, if you blaspheme my name, it's the same punishment as killing somebody. These are laid side by side. Apply that to us today. What's the worst death we could cause somebody? She said, wouldn't it be the spiritual death? Yeah. Do we cause that type of problem with people? What is our example? Makes a scary thought. Maybe I need to watch where I put my feet a little bit better. Okay. Yes, sir.
Also, the scripture talks about he who hates somebody is considered a murderer.
I didn't think about that, but that is true. We got to watch this hate thing, because he who hates someone is a murderer. And what's the penalty? You know, we see this here. It's kind of heavy to think about, but it comes back to this thing we've talked about several times, and that is that we're, in essence, talking about creation, creating life. That's what God did. That's what this is all about, life. Death is a result of that physically, but it's all about life. And we should be thinking a lot about eternal life here. For them, they're wandering in the wilderness. And they have been shown here in this last example. Well, let's take them all three. We have the light, the lampstand that's supposed to stay lit. We have the bread. This sustains them. And we have actions that have consequences. Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Remember it. That's the concept we have in here. I wrote as a comment in here, I copied it. Those who enjoy covenant blessings must be careful not to repudiate the author of the covenant. I thought that was a good.
What does it say again?
Those, let me read it to get it right. Those who enjoy covenant blessings, that's us, covenant blessings with God, must be careful not to repudiate the author of the covenant. Reject. It's not God. He's not really God. He can't do this. Jesus didn't forgive our sins. Yes, he did. And when we, once again, go back to that phrase, crucify Christ afresh, one of the things we talked about early on with all the sacrifices were for unintentional sins. When we purposely decide we're going to reject Christ, we are crucifying him again, afresh. That's the context here. That's kind of the overwhelming message I see out of this, is that we can intentionally disobey God. That should be a very scary thought for us to even approach doing that. Thank you for your comments and your time today. Next week, chapter 25.